Good evening, everyone. My name is Mohammed Hamdawi, and I'm the Director of the Economic Studies Department at Trends Research and Advisory. On behalf of Trends, I would like to welcome our viewers from across the globe to this live e-lecture on the topic of recovery of the global economy with Dr. Patrick Schroeder. After more than a year since the onset of this unprecedented pandemic, the world is still struggling to contain this virus and deal with the health and socioeconomic impacts of this pandemic. A lot has changed since the onset of this pandemic. We know more about the virus, or at least scientists know more about the virus. We have a number of effective vaccines that we developed and are helping us address, and hopefully go back to normal very soon. Governments have also responded with massive stimulus packages, something we haven't seen before in terms of scale and size and breadth and depth. And we also have adjusted our ways to the new normal. We're doing things differently than we used to, whether it's education, whether it's shopping, whether it's business meetings. However, a new variant of the virus continue to challenge several countries. The asymmetry in the response between different countries, some countries just don't have the means to address and spend the money they need to spend to address the effects of this pandemic. Also, the big difference in the speed and access to vaccination between different countries, all these elements will continue to cast doubt on the pace of the recovery. The cost of the pandemic has been great, both in terms of lives and livelihoods. Close to 3 million people have died. Millions of people lost their jobs, some temporarily, some would probably lose their jobs for good. Several companies went for bankruptcy. And a lot of people, millions of people fell in poverty, reversing the trends of declining poverty across the globe for many years. Also, the responses from countries have been quite different, with different impact on the economy. So certain countries acted swiftly with massive testing and strong measures to stop the spread, strong leadership, decisions that were made centrally, but also decisions were made centrally, but the application of those rules and regulation were left to the regional governments. Some others failed miserably and had inadequate approaches. And here I'm talking about rich developed countries who initially did not have either the leadership or had to come up with plans to address the effects of the pandemic, either because of lack of leadership, divisive politics, and insufficient medical infrastructure and resources. Just to not to pick on any country, but we've seen the debates in certain countries in Europe on the science and the merits of certain treatment for COVID, and where politicians, unfortunately, with no background in medical sciences, started addressing and talking about policies and how to address this issue. Where the science was telling them to do certain things, the politicians, driven by different motivation, decided to do things that are opposite to what the science was telling them. We've seen, and we see now, anti-vaccination rhetoric in a lot of countries. So people, not choosing to vaccinate as a political stance. And in the US, for instance, also we saw even wearing a mask has become a political statement. During the campaign, the divisive campaign we had in the US. I think in general, this crisis has brought the good and the ugly in all of us. So we've seen touching display of humanity, the support that the medical corps had, the support across the globe, the communities coming together to help the needy, to help the elderly. And we saw the ugly face of greed, even recently with countries, or hoarding vaccines for their own country and not thinking that this is a global issue. You can vaccinate all your citizens, and if somebody traveled from a poor country with the vaccine, then you're back to square zero. Again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to get into the science behind that, but we've seen that greed both at the individual and government level. Now, in terms of recovery, we've seen a massive drop in output in Q2 and Q3. major lockdowns, a massive drop in demand, uncertainty across the globe. I think we've never seen in our lifetime something of that scale and magnitude. We've seen a recovery in Q4. Again, if you think of recovery just as a measure of economic output in terms of GDP, then you talk about recovery. But I guess as we get into this conversation, we'll talk about whether that's a true measure of economic prosperity and whether we should only aim for getting back the economy to the pre-COVID-19 levels ASAP. Some industries fared better than others. Some technology, ICT, education. Some countries did better than others. So either structurally, were countries that were not as connected, poor countries relatively did managed the pandemic relatively well. Some countries who had the resources, the medical facilities, the decisive leadership in terms of vaccination and testing. We've seen countries that decided that they're not going to compromise on the well-being of its citizens and not put the economy ahead of people. So people came first. I live in the UAE, so I'm gonna say that's one example where, at the highest level of leadership, there was a decision to make sure that medical supplies, medicine, and food is a red line, that everybody should and will have access to those. There will be no panic trying to go buy a loaf of bread or anything. Again, I would say that the nature of the response, the quality of the medical infrastructure, the confidence in leadership, as well as the size and nature of the stimulus package, all seem to have influenced or have an influence on the speed and size of the recovery. But again, I'm sure Dr. Schroeder will go into this into more detail. Are all countries on a path of recovery? Is it too soon to talk about a recovery? And have countries done enough in terms of stimulus package, or are they targeting those stimulus package into where we need them to achieve this recovery? And again, the other question is, are we going back to the old normal? Is that good enough? Are we going to take this opportunity to reset the button, or to push the reset button and think about something better? Those questions are all valid, as a lot of countries are going back or are dealing with the third wave of infections. Some countries have gone into some form of lockdown. France is having that curfew. I think, I don't remember the detail, but it's for a month. There's travel halting between certain countries. So are we going to see, again, the other question is, are vaccines effective for this new variant of viruses? So all these questions basically are shedding a lot of doubt around the recovery. And again, the last point I mentioned around the consideration when talking about the recovery is, what kind of recovery do we want? So, we want to go back to the way we did things, or do we take a chance to rethink a more sustainable economic development model that takes care of addressing the inequality, addressing the digital disconnect between people who had access to good connection and we were able to have attainment in education, others, whether it's within rich countries or poor countries, we didn't have access to technology. I guess my personal opinion is that the focus should be on economic prosperity that is driven by the desire to achieve equality, the desire to allow and provide basic services to all, and also think about sustainability and how we can have that, the green revolution, if you want to call it that way, and addressing the implication on the environment. Again, if we just think of going back to the pre-COVID GDP numbers in the way they are achieved, then I would say we have lost a great opportunity. I'm going to stop here. We'll have plenty of opportunity to converse with Dr. Schroeder. I'll introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Patrick Schroeder. He's a senior research fellow of the Energy, Environment, and Resource Programs at Chatham House. His focus is on global transition to an inclusive circular economy. His research focuses on the contribution of the circular economy to the Sustainable Development Goals, policy framework, financing the circular economy, and implication for global trade. His experience spanned many years across multiple research institutions. He has a BA in Chinese from the University of Westminster and received his master's in international relations Relations and PhD in Environmental Studies from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Dr. Schroeder, we're really happy to have you here. The floor is yours. You have 30 minutes or so to go through your presentation, and we'll have questions and discussion afterwards based on the question we receive from our viewers. And the floor is yours.
Yes, great. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. And as you heard from the introduction, my background is in environmental studies and political science. So I'm not a traditional economist, although the topic I'm working on, the circular economy, is very much about linking environmental issues around resource scarcity, but also pollution issues with economic innovation and new businesses. And I will talk about this a little bit later at the end of my talk. So many of the issues have already been mentioned. I prepared a number of slides that I will go through, and let me just share my screen. I think you should all be able to see the screen now.
Yeah.
Yes, so from my perspective, when thinking about the recovery of the global economy, again, I'm repeating what Mohammed mentioned before. What do we need to do to achieve an inclusive and green recovery? I think that should be the priority. We shouldn't just try to get any type of growth without considering of the sustainability and inequality dimensions. And in my talk, I have 3 parts, roughly. So I want to look at some of the economic data to see where we are at the moment. Are we stuck somewhere between recovery and another slowdown? Then following this, I want to talk briefly about the roles of government and private sector in terms of policies, but also business initiatives or new business opportunities. And the third part is about the opportunities for green and inclusive recovery. So generally speaking, in 2021, we still globally struggle to contain the global COVID-19 health pandemic. And there are many uncertainties what it means. And I don't have all the answers. I think I might have some answers which relate to the opportunity to accelerate the shift to a sustainable economy. There are some good ideas out there that we need to start applying in earnest. And I'll come to that further down the line. Just looking at the World Economic Outlook that was published by the IMF in the beginning of the year. So that you can see there are some of the GDP figures here. And for example, you look at the advanced economies, there was a drop of 4.9% of GDP last year. And the prediction is that it will bounce back by 4.3% this year. If you look at emerging economies, emerging and developing economies, it was 2.4 decline last year and a bounce back of more than 6 is predicted for this year. But just looking at these figures, I think doesn't tell the whole story. You look at it and you think the advanced economies had been hit a lot harder than the developing world. So it also doesn't show the difference between the countries. So if you look at some of the more detailed aspects, you would see, I mean, China is the largest major economy that had a positive growth last year. So by putting China into the category of emerging markets and developing economies, it in a way skews a little bit the impact of some of the other developing economies. So if you look at, for example, India, which shrunk quite significantly, but also Latin America and the Caribbean, South Africa, for instance. Then obviously in Europe, some of the economies that have been hit very hard, the UK where I'm based, but also Spain and France. And as you might, when you followed the news, you would have seen there's now a trend which seems to indicate that these European countries are going into another peak, another wave. So that really puts a question mark about the predicted recovery and the growth figures. So I would think they have been too optimistic. I don't think it'll be that quick and that strong of a rebound, but it remains to be seen. So the other aspect that we shouldn't forget is, and this is also what the GDP figures don't show, is the increase again in absolute poverty. So if you look at these figures, so by the end of 2020, we were back at 730 million people living in absolute poverty. And depending now on the recovery and also the rollout of the vaccinations, that could even increase to 750 million by end of 2021. So this is also an indication that developing countries, especially kind of low income groups and marginalized populations, they have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic. So this can also be broken down further if we don't just look at absolute poverty, but if we look at also the other categories, we see there's been an increase in these too. And the countries that have been hit mostly are India, South Asia, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And now specifically on one of the sectors that has been hit particularly hard has been the textile and garment industry. So we know that has been caused by a destruction in demand, basically in the consumer countries. Especially women who are working in the factories have been hit particularly hard. And you can see some of the data here from the major producer countries. This only goes until June last year, but the impact has been quite significant in terms of cancellation of orders and workers being laid off. And I don't think the situation has improved very much at this stage. And so this is quite a significant crisis. So if we go to the next part, the role of the government and private sector. So to what we've seen really is that the COVID has brought back the government as an important economic actor. So the government was hugely important to save companies, bail out companies, provide social safety nets for workers, etc., etc. And what we can also see that the governments which have acted early and with strict measures to control the pandemic, they also appear to have suffered less in terms of their economic impacts and less disruptions, although no country has been immune to the disruptions of the global value chains. But it seems also those countries are on a better path to recovery. This is took this information from an interesting website, which you can see the link down here. And it really shows these two measures that governments have taken. The red lines are the public health responses taken by governments, and the blue ones are the economic measures to, as I mentioned before, to save the economy and to save industries. And this only goes until, now the data go till October last year, but it's what's quite revealing is that the public health responses, they're becoming weaker. They have become weaker over time. However, the economic response has remained pretty stable. And my expectation is that in 2021, it'll be similar to that. So there will be continued economic responses by the governments to facilitate or to prevent further economic decline and or collapse. Now, in terms of the industries which have fared positively in the pandemic, this is an interesting figure and interesting data from McKinsey, which have asked companies about their Industry 4.0 implementation. Industry 4.0 meaning robotics, but applications of artificial intelligence, IoT, and there's a clear indication that during the pandemic, Industry 4.0 implementation has matured. Industry 4.0 has become, according to the respondents, a lot more valuable. So we can see that this type of manufacturing and other businesses have proven to be more resilient. So it's also, you can see this trend probably has been accelerated now through the pandemic. Furthermore, I mean, this is also linked to services and digitalization of businesses. So this is from UNCTAD, and these insights are relevant now also for countries thinking about the recovery. Services can be used strategically to facilitate an economic transformation, and we've seen in the pandemic the acceleration of these. So ICT services that have enabled working from home, then digital financial services, e-commerce platforms, all of these have been crucial to keep economies going during the lockdown. But what's also revealed, again, there's this structural gap between developed and developing countries. And then this is crucial for advancing an inclusive global recovery. So this gap and like digitally enabled services, this is really something that needs to be addressed, and in developing countries, capabilities in these fields need to be supported to close that gap. These are some of my former colleagues at the Institute of Development Studies published a report just a few days ago about building back a better world, the crisis and opportunity of COVID-19. And they've been looking at how the recovery needs to be governed. And they identified short-term priorities, but also some transformative governance agenda for the longer term. And in the short term, 3 key recommendations that come out of this report is that financial pressure on vulnerable groups need to be eased. State capacity and adaptability needs to be increased, especially local governments who've often been over-challenged with the pandemic. And again, linking back to the previous slides, enable inclusive service delivery by improving access to data and ICT. Then for the longer term, one of the points that has been mentioned, progressive taxation is an important measure for also governments in terms of public finances. Provide inclusive and network decision-making processes, and accountability relationships between citizens and states. So we've seen that in many countries, due to the pandemic, there's been lots of decline in trust between citizens and governments, lack of trust in public institutions. So all of this needs to be rebuilt once as part of the recovery, really. So this is an agenda which looks quite beyond just simple economic recovery. So picking up on the tax reforms, that has also been put forward by the International Monetary Fund. The IMF recommends tax policy reforms after the economies have recovered from the COVID crisis, and we see some fiscal consolidation. And again, in view of inclusive recovery, fiscal policy needs to continue an important role with a progressive tax system that's needed. So specifically, what's recommended is to broaden VAT base, apply better use of carbon taxes, property taxes, and inheritance taxes. Now I come to the third part about the opportunities for green and inclusive recovery. So this is, I think everybody seems to agree on this, that we need this. This has also been mentioned by the UN General Secretary, that the recovery needs to be green and in line with climate objectives and biodiversity. However, how to do this? This is the big question. It's easier said than done. And so the most immediate probably opportunity is now to use the green recovery plans and stimulus packages to ensure that government funds do not go into what you call sectors or industries which further accelerate global environmental risks. So it's also an opportunity to accelerate this transition to more sustainable development models. That's both necessary and possible. Again, the devil's in the detail, how to do this. There are some ideas which I will try to explain a little bit. So, I mean, just looking at, again, some McKinsey figures about energy demand in the recovery. So on the left-hand side, we see the oil demand, which has declined. However, we can see some type of V-shaped recovery over the next 2 to 4 years, depending, again, whether the virus is contained or whether there will be some new outbreaks, etc. However, in the long term, to 2030, so oil demand is expected to stabilize at around these levels here. So it's quite different with coal. So coal has declined quite significantly also during the pandemic, but it's not expected to recover. So this is not only due to the pandemic, but also wider issues in the transformation to a low carbon or even net zero economies. So that trend of the decline in coal has to some degree been accelerated by the transition, by the pandemic. So we can see also investors are not, there are hardly any investments going into coal. So we can see actually McKinsey saying coal has already peaked in 2014. From the climate perspective, this is good news. However, again, we're talking also often about how to facilitate a just transition, which means we need to consider also the industries and the communities which depend on, for instance, coal industry. So that the just transition approach here is very important. Again, here are some of IMF recommendations where governments should invest their public funds. What type of green projects should be promoted? So they're talking about boosting climate smart infrastructure, which includes renewables, but also investments into the grid, low carbon public transport, again, digital infrastructure. Also, one of the other investments should be going into developing and adopting climate smart technologies, batteries, hydrogen, carbon capture, supporting adaptation, also very crucial, especially in the developing world, and avoiding carbon intensive investments, fossil fuel power and high emission vehicles. Then this is an interesting study which came out, I think about a month ago, that's conducted by UNEP and Oxford, where they have looked at the various recovery spending of the governments that were announced until the end of 2020. And they try to classify it into, as you see here, what has been green and what has been not green. And so unfortunately, the overall green spend is, I think, roughly about 18% of the overall spending. So $341 billion have been put into green projects. The good news, actually, there's some good news here too, because if we look at initially the recovery funds, there was hardly any green elements or green projects. So they, as time went on, and governments became clear about what they want to fund, how they want to transform their economies. So the share of green has become larger. However, so the assessment of that study is that global recovery spending has so far missed the opportunity for green investment. And you can see also a breakdown of where the money was spent. So 66 billion in low carbon energy, and that's most of this Spanish and German subsidies for renewable energy projects and hydrogen. 86 billion for green transport, 35 billion for green buildings, 56 billion for natural capital or nature-based solutions, and also quite significant 28 billion for green research and development. Now this is a small cartoon that I saw today in my Twitter feed, and I thought to copy this. And that's the point really about just having more green is not really good enough. So it does, to some degree, changing cars to green, to, for example, fuel efficient cars or electric vehicles, or have green packaging, green aircrafts, does not fundamentally change the economic system, and is not going to put us on a pathway to a sustainable world. It won't be enough to meet the 1.5 degrees target. So we need to think a little bit more beyond that. So, and this is where my topic, the circular economy, comes in, which is we like to think of a systems-based approach, where we try to take life cycle perspectives and not only consider energy, but also materials and waste. And we generally look at the value chain, and there are a number of approaches that can be applied And traditionally, probably most people, when they hear the term circular economy, they think about this aspect of creating loops, recycling or looping materials back into the production and consumption system through repair, reuse, remanufacture, industrial symbiosis, etc. So that's one part of it. The other parts that we also try to think about is how to slow flows of materials throughput. And slowing flows, there are various approaches how this can be achieved. For example, extending the use cycle of products, or enabling additional use cycles at end of first life. And one of the current principles of the economy, which is called planned obsolescence, and many businesses operate on this model. This doesn't fit into the circular economy model because it depends on fast and high throughput, creating a lot of waste products at the end of life, and also generating a pool of resources from generating more need for extraction. So this is one of the issues that need to be tackled, also to narrow flows, and we need to also create new utilization patterns of basically how we use stuff. And this is then again the link to what we've seen also in the pandemic, the shift towards services and digitalization. How can we provide services and the function of products versus there's new business models which are trying to develop around this. So shared ownership versus individual ownership, or as I said, providing function rather than actually having the actual thing. So there's lots of innovative thinking happening around this. And I think through the pandemic, there has been also some acceleration here. Just on policy level, the EU has put out its new Circular Economy Action Plan early in 2021, which builds on previous work in the circular economy, and it's also a key pillar to implementing the European Green Deal. And I pulled out some text from this action plan, and you see it's not only about environment, but it's very much about strengthening value chains within the EU and globally, build industrial ecosystems which are more resilient and sustainable. It also links to what's often called strategic autonomy of the EU. It aims to create new jobs. And so the member states are tasked now to mainstream circular economy into their national recovery plans. And then again, yeah, it's also considered to be a key element of creating new innovation and creating competitive businesses. So it's a comprehensive approach, and I'm quite positive about it. And it can be, if it's done in the right way, it can achieve many benefits. We see also on international level, there are some developments that are taking place. So there was the launch of the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency in March 2021. So this was launched during the United Nations Environment Assembly, and the EU and UNEP are involved. So is UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and a number of other countries have also joined. So I've listed them here. And what we saw in February 2021 was the launch of a Latin America and Caribbean Circular Economy Coalition by various ministries, including Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, plus a range of international and intergovernmental organizations. So there's quite some momentum on this. And this goes now even a step further. And there are many discussions, not only in Europe, but I understand also in other places, around what's called a well-being economy. So it's really questioning the focus of the economy being focused on GDP as the main indicator. So the shift is really to focus on human needs associated with employment, but also mental and physical health, education, housing. And it's not necessarily a new discussion. There have been numerous initiatives in the past. There's also plenty of research that shows how GDP alone is inadequate really to give an indication about progress and the well-being of society. And there's various other indicators which are available, and these are coming in handy at this stage. So again, here the pandemic might have been a game changer to achieve this shift. I wanted to briefly mention the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. A number of governments have joined these, including Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Costa Rica, and a range of other organizations are in support. So these are at the moment only small countries, but they have been quite at the forefront of thinking about the issues of sustainability, well-being, human needs, sustainable development. So there are some interesting experiments also on policy level that should be also applicable to other countries. Just as the final slide, just to mention, the year 2021, many people talk about as the super year for the environment, mainly because there are a number of very, very crucial and high-level international conferences and events taking place. At the end of the year, there will be the COP26 on climate change take place in Glasgow. It's co-hosted by the UK and the Italian governments. China will host the Biodiversity Summit. It was supposed to take place in May, but it's now been postponed to October. And along the way, you can see a whole range of other important meetings, including the G7 summit, also G20 chaired by Italy, and various other events on UN level. So I expect what we will see is a big push on policy level towards the greener recovery. And again, I guess this will create new momentum also for industry, for investment, to shape the recovery in a way that is compatible with the future and reduces these systemic risks, rather than going back to the previous economy, which we have now seen is very vulnerable and not resilient to shocks such as COVID. So I think, yeah, that's all from my side. Thanks for your attention. Happy to discuss more. This is also my email in case you want to get in touch. Please feel free to email.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you. Great presentation. I took a lot of notes. We have 15 minutes-ish to kind of cover a few questions. I'll start from the last point you mentioned around the need for kind of a new way of thinking about the economy and kind of hitting the reset button, as I said initially. And you talk about a lot of initiatives, the Wellbeing Economy Alliances, the circular economy, which probably is accelerated by the COVID pandemic and the issues around supply chain resiliency. I just want to ask you this question. You mentioned some of the initiatives, but are you seeing any solid signals that indicate the desire of governments to hit the reset button and use this crisis to rethink the development model beyond and above what you mentioned in your presentation?
Yes and no. The problem is, I mean, I don't think there is a reset button we can push where everything goes back to zero and then we start again, unfortunately. But yeah, I think we need to look at it as a window of opportunity where things can change and have changed. And the pandemic has already created some changes, which I assume are going to stay. In terms of development model, so that's again also different for different countries. If we, for example, go back, if we think about how South Asian countries have been impacted through the destruction and demand of fashion and garments. So the development model based on export of fast-moving consumer goods, for example, probably needs to be questioned. And probably the opportunity here is to think about diversification, how to create more resilient economies, which are not so highly dependent on global value chains. So that's, and here, both the ideas around the circular economy, but also then the need to go low carbon, they all play into this. So all these issues need to be considered together in a systematic way. I think that would be my main answer.
I think just to link to what you mentioned around the textile situation, I didn't know about all the number and the extent of people who lost their jobs directly linked to the drop in demand and the break in the supply chain. I think one thing when I was listening to you, I took a note here talking about blockchain and distributed ledgers in terms of addressing the issues around inefficiencies in the supply chain and hopeful again, how can we use the technology? Again, I'm thinking out loud here. Can we use the technology to address some of the inefficiencies in the supply chain and hopefully address the need for cheap, kind of labor and supply with the need for a resilient supply chain, as we saw here, during this pandemic. A lot of a break in the supply chain caused a lot of headaches for a lot of industries in Europe and the US. I mean, how can we, is there an opportunity there for, again, I'm just thinking of use of technology to address these issues and avoid this kind of social cost for future pandemics? And I know it's not an area of your expertise, but I'm just something maybe for some other.
So I can just explain from circular economy and supply chains discussions. So there's a lot of talk about creating what people call our electronic product passports, which would be probably based on blockchain and ledgers. And these product passports would contain information about the materials to provide traceability. With the goal of knowing where products come from, where materials are sourced, but also to understand where do they go at the end of life. Mm-hmm. And when setting up these product passports, some thinking would be that a whole range of other information could also be included. So including on issues around due diligence, social issues in the supply chains, how companies, or to some degree about working conditions. So if you have a comprehensive set of information, this would overall benefit in creating higher value in value chains, but also to understand in a way questions around how is value distributed along the value chains, who has the benefit, and how can it be redistributed to have some more equitable outcomes within these various chains. But yeah, this is all work in progress. But I guess a lot of this could happen a lot faster than we think.
I think that's, again, another good segue to my next question. I think there are two related questions, although slightly different. You talked about the Industrial Revolution 4.0 and the digitalization or the impact of digital on the economy. And I'm going to apply that same logic to energy. So there is a digital divide. There are countries who are at much higher speed than others. There's, as I mentioned in my opening statement, there are even connectivity. I saw actually an image that was sent to me from one of my friends. I don't know, it's in Latin America, but this father who can build this blue tent from tarp in the one location in the village where there is a connectivity. And you see the kid with his phone, not even a tablet, phone, trying to follow the class, versus others who have access to all the speed of the speed and the facilities and the technology. So there is that big digital divide between developing countries and developed countries, and even within the developed countries. There are a lot of issues in Europe where certain marginalized communities didn't have access to decent connectivity and struggled to actually benefit from the same access to education. Energy is exactly the same. We talk about energy transition. We showed the graph around the decline in coal demand. I think 2013-14 peak demand. There is no coming back. There's some structural issues that are going against coal. There's a debate around where the peak demand for oil is, but there are around 902 billion people who do not have access to electricity or have inadequate access to electricity. So how can you convince those people that we are in this together and we need to address the issues that are serious: climate change, environmental, the excessive use of natural resources. So how can we build that balance between addressing the needs of these people who don't have nots and the people who are actually driving the transition and this technological development? How can we balance that to hopefully get to the point you're talking about of a green recovery that is more inclusive?
Yes, yeah, very big
Difficult
question. No, but I'm thinking about these things as well. And on the one hand, there's, for example, you mentioned Industry 4.0 at the beginning. There's the danger that this gap even grows wider, as some countries already have a head start. And so when we wrote our report on circular economy opportunities in Latin America last year, we cooperated with UNIDO. And so within the circular economy, often there tends to be the focus to look at waste in the first place. Mm-hmm. However, the UNIDO colleagues made a strong case for we need to look beyond that. And we wrote a section also on the link between circular economy and Industry 4.0 with the objective to send a message also to decision makers. This is not something that's only happening in the developed world. This is an opportunity, and there's the need also for governments to take this serious, and otherwise, as I said, this gap will become even wider. In terms of the access to electricity, I think from my perspective, now renewables have come down in prices so significantly. So closing this gap in terms of access to electricity, that can be, I think that gap can be closed by focusing on really decentralized off-grid renewable solutions. And there are many things happening. I think from some of the data that I saw also in the recovery, some of the also multilateral development banks, these are projects which definitely will receive a lot of attention, also as part of the green recovery. So again, by putting the money into these projects, we can achieve both closing the gap, but also then addressing issues around poverty, connectivity, and the clean energy revolution. So there are solutions which can tick various boxes. We just need to make sure that that these are being realized.
Yeah, and I agree with you absolutely on the last point. There is, I would even go further to say that there is no solution to fill that gap without using renewable and distributed generation. There is no way poor countries will go through the regular model of building a big centralized power plant and then building all the infrastructure that connects the distribution of the electricity to this remote location. So there is no solution in my mind that wouldn't involve the use of renewable energy and technologies that enable the ability to pay as you go, or use technology in terms of optimization of the use of renewable energy storage, etc. So for me, I would go to that extent. We have a couple of questions that came from viewers. We talked about sectors. Some sectors didn't feel was not hit by the pandemic. Some others recovered faster. The question here is how. Sorry, I was reading the wrong one. What sectors seem likely to outperform others in the race to recovery? So for the sectors that were impacted, which one will recover faster?
Yes, very, very difficult to answer. I think it will depend on, it will be country specific to some degree. I would think, so some of the sectors, for example, tourism, I think have been hit quite hard. I would expect once the pandemic is under control, that sector will bounce back quite quickly. I think others will take longer. One of the sectors that was also hit hard here in Europe has been entertainment, arts, cultural type of sectors. I think for those it will be quite without significant government support. It might take a while. But I think, I'm not quite sure really. I think
that's a difficult one, Patrick. I would say just, again, I think all sectors that require people to gather, will take some time until we get to that level of vaccination that we're comfortable going back to kind of a pseudo-normal engagement. So those are your cinemas, your restaurants, your sporting events, and etc. Some of, as you said, tourism. I think some countries are doing better than others. We have a lot of destinations that are reopened. There are a lot of new best practices in terms of how you handle traffic and get people flying from point A to point B while minimizing the risk. I think I agree with you, and it's going to be country specific as well. I think maybe one final question, and we'll give you an opportunity to have a final statement. Our country is have done enough, or our country's done enough with the stimulus packages to improve the confidence of the consumers. We're already, based on your slide, there's not enough money for green projects. So keep that point to the side in terms of pure financial stimulus or money go into the economy, are these stimulus packages enough to improve the economy and speed up the recovery? Again, maybe we'll focus on Europe and the US, because I think that's probably
again, I think yes and no. In terms of, I mean, there's a lot of money that's going into the economy. I would think maybe again from not only from the perspective of a green recovery, but also in terms of how to address the inequality that also emerged. Maybe governments need to think going forward a little bit more how to design the recovery packages in a way that it benefits low-income groups. How does it create new employment? How does it contribute to some of the other social issues that have emerged? I think these will be the bigger questions which are coming up over this year and next year. So in that respect, I think governments need to think a little bit more about these aspects of the recovery.
Absolutely, and I think the third wave hitting Europe and the challenges that Brazil is facing and the uncertainty around this new variant that is actually appearing in different countries in Africa, that's going to be a big question mark for them, and it's something to keep an eye on for the next few weeks. Patrick, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, and I really appreciated the presentation. We have a couple of minutes for final thoughts, please.
Okay, yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thanks for all the viewers to join. I hope you got something out of it. I'm happy to share the presentation. So if you wanted to access some of the information that I've shown. In terms of, maybe I come back to the topic on circular economy that I'm working on. So I really hope that that is a topic you might, if you haven't heard about it before, that you become more interested in. And what we're doing at Chatham House, we're doing research on the topic, but we're also engaging internationally with governments, with companies, with multilateral organizations to promote a circular economy agenda which is inclusive, which tries to not only create business opportunities, but which also addresses some of the other issues that I tried to highlight today. And I'm quite optimistic that the circular economy concept will become more prominent over the next decade, including in the SDG context, but also in the short term in the recovery. So I would, please watch that space. I think it's quite exciting. There's a lot of room for innovation and new thinking, out of the box thinking, and a lot of very interesting developments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick. We definitely will definitely reach out and talk about this topic offline. We have one of our research programs is around environment and sustainable development, and circular economy is very critical to the whole concept. So definitely an opportunity for us at Trent and you at Chatham to talk about that concept and think of ways to promote the concept here, because ultimately it's an issue that is pertinent to all countries, and there's so many or so much natural resources that we can use, and ultimately recycling, circular economy has to play a role in sustainable development. A great discussion. I would have loved to keep it going, but we have run out of time, and I would like to thank you, Patrick, personally for your presentation, for the time we spent talking about the recovery. Still a lot of questions to be answered, and hopefully there is a speed up in the vaccination across multiple countries. It's an issue that needs to be addressed globally, so we should have no one left behind in terms of access to vaccination. And I'm hoping that there will be more effort to provide vaccination to the countries who can't afford to get them or don't have the connection to actually have the success of some of key countries in the emerging world. I think ultimately we have to collaborate on these issues because this is a global issue, as is climate change and environmental consideration, and no one can go it alone. I think for us collectively, the messaging around how important those issues are to a big chunk of population in different countries who do not think those are serious issues is something that we need to get better at as well. I'd like to thank all people who attended the event. It will be made available on our platforms. And Patrick will talk about ways to make those slides available in that format or in a research paper that we can publish on our website. And before I finish, I'd just like to thank the technical team here at Trends who you don't see them on the screens, but they do all the job, all the necessary work to make sure that it works. It's not easy, believe me. And last thing, there is an event. We have our next event our symposium will be on the future of resources and sustainability. So perfect timing. And Patrick would like you to just listen to the event and we'll send you the details. It will be on Tuesday, the 6th of April at 7 p.m. UAE time. And you're all welcome to attend, and it's the same platforms on on all our social media platform, Facebook, YouTube, and others. With that, I'll stop talking, and thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Patrick, again, and we'll talk to you later. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.